We've all seen those clickbaity, how I would learn to code if I started over videos. And I always thought I would avoid making one. And honestly, I'm going to continue. That said, I saw this article and I was very excited for it. So we're going to read it. This is the closest you're ever going to get for one of those classic OG, how I would learn to code from the start videos. But I just want to read this blog post because it looked cool and the author's a bro. So without further ado, let's dive into M. Buffett's post, a bunch of programming advice I'd give myself 15 years ago. I finally have the feeling that I'm a decent programmer, so I thought it would be fun to write some advice with the idea of what would have gotten me to this point faster. I'm not claiming that this is great advice for everyone, just that it would have been good advice for me. Let's see if it'll be good advice for me as well. Very curious. This is a lot of my comments like to let me know I'm still clearly not a very good programmer. To each their own. If you or your team are shooting yourselves in the foot constantly, fix the gun. This better not become anti-React. I can't tell you how many times I've been on a team and there's something about the system that's very easy to screw up, but no one thinks about ways to make it harder to make that mistake. When I was doing iOS dev, used core data and subscribed to changes from a bunch of views. The subscription callback came on the same thread that the change was triggered from. Sometimes that was the main thread, and sometimes it was a background thread. Importantly, in iOS dev, you can only make UI updates on the main thread, or your app crashes. So a new subscription could be working fine, but then it would break when someone triggered an update from a background thread, or if you add a UI update later on. These are always really fun. If you have some code that is working fine, but it's on main thread, you're like, oh, for performance reasons, I'm going to move it. And then don't test it thoroughly enough, and then it breaks for your users. I've seen this in all sorts of things. This is not exclusive to iOS. This is development of applications. This was just something that people transparently accepted and often came up in reviews for newer people on the team. Every now and then, one would slip through, and we'd go add a dispatch queue.main.async when we saw the crash report. I decided to fix it, and it took 10 minutes to update our subscription layer to call subscribers on the main thread itself, which eliminated a whole class of crashes and a bit of mental load. I'm not trying to be like, look at these idiots not fixing an obvious issue with the code base when it was obvious to me, because it would have been obvious to anyone who thought about it for a few minutes. I had one of these recently where I was helping a certain undisclosed application that had a certain massive bill and a really slow site on a certain service. And when I looked at their code, they had like 5+ Prisma database calls on every API endpoint, all blocking, even though they had no data in common. So they had a big await block before you even start the request just to get the user data. Then they had another giant await huge query to get some more data. Then right after, 3 more queries. And I was able to 4x their performance by just taking all those queries and putting them in a promise.all so that they could all run in parallel instead of individually. Do I think those devs suck? I'll mince my words. But theoretically, any of them could have looked at it and been like, yeah, that's dumb. We probably shouldn't do it that way. It's not that I am so much better than those other devs. It's just that I've done it more. I care a lot, and I'm a fresh set of eyes on the code base. It's like, yeah, this should be better. And as the author says here, these things tend to stick around a weird amount because there's never a natural time to address them. I see this so often, especially with performance stuff, because if your performance sucks, when do you fix it? Usually when it sucks so bad that it's causing problems, and not until then. When you're first getting onboarded, you're not trying to change anything big. I am an exception here. I have had times where I joined a code base that was massive and I was like, wait, you guys aren't using Prettier? You guys don't have ESLint set up? It's 2024 and you're still writing this JavaScript like it's the early 2000s? And I've had times where my first pull request to a repo was like 100,000 line change and everyone hated me. But then a week later, they liked me. But yes, you probably shouldn't be trying to change anything big. What you should be doing is reading the pull request tab. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to, in parallel, write my advice to younger Theo. Advice to younger Theo. And I expect this to be different, but have overlap in the lessons. The first one I want to put in here is don't learn a code base through the code tab. Start in the PR tab. I've said this for a while, and I'll continue emphasizing it. When you're working on a big code base for the first time, the worst thing you can do is start by reading the code. Because in a giant code base, the vast majority of the code hasn't been touched, possibly for a decade even. 90% plus of the code in a big code base just doesn't get touched. And if you spend all your time trying to read and understand that code, you're screwed. But if you go and read a whole bunch of pull requests, you see what is merging, what people push back on, what is changing and why it's changing, your understanding of that code base will be significantly better than if you just try to read it line by line. In fact, if you had 2 people, one who has read all of the code and one who has read half the pull requests, I promise you, the one who's read half the pull requests understands the code base significantly better than the person who's seen every line of code in it. Guaranteed. Yeah, back to the article. As they said, when you're first getting onboarded, you're not trying to change everything, and certainly not anything big. So you may think it's weird, but you shouldn't go changing a bunch of things that you're still learning about. Then, when you've been on the team for a while, it sort of just fades into the background. I really like this framing, because if you show up to a new code base and you're like, this seems wrong, you're often too scared to do the right thing. And then after a while, once you're comfortable, it's now become normalized to you. That's a really good framing I had not thought of before. And it's actually something I try to index on when I'm running teams. I'm going to add another point to my takes, which is it's very easy to get into the state where if somebody new is showing up on the project, they haven't touched it all before, and they say, hey, these things are weird. You're like, oh, don't worry, you'll get used to it. But you're saying that because you yourself are used to it. It doesn't mean it's normal, doesn't mean it's good. So what I've learned to do is listen extra carefully when the dev shows up on the project for the first time. What stands out to them? What went wrong in the onboarding? What was unclear when they started reading through the code? What made their first pull request hard to do? You don't get that feedback from your existing devs because they're all Stockholmed into it. So the only way you can actually improve on those metrics is by taking massive advantage of the unique opportunity of a dev trying out your code base and trying to contribute to it for the first time. That's a rare experience. And if you want it to be better for the next dev, listen very carefully to the current one who's onboarding right now. And I couldn't agree more that this is super common, that devs are scared to make the big change based on what they expect. And then by the time they have the confidence, it's too normalized and they move on. It's a mindset shift. You just need to occasionally remind yourself that you are capable of making you and your team's life easier when these sorts of things are hanging around. Absolutely. Absolutely agree. First, there's actually a good question here. Do you worry that person is coming in and trying to make what is comfortable to everyone else more comfortable for them or what they're used to seeing? That's a conversation to have. But chances are, if you're showing up and you've worked in other code bases, especially at a company, like when I was at Twitch, I touched like probably 20 plus code bases in a meaningful way. And when I was working on most of them, the tooling was relatively consistent. There was obviously lots of differences between them. But then when I would show up in another code base from a different team, I'd be like, oh, you guys are just behind the standards of the rest of the company. Can I propose some changes to make these things a little more in sync? And usually a couple devs would push back, but a few others would be like, yeah, I worked on 2 other code bases here and those were better. We should have that here too. And as long as you can build a few allies and have a good conversation, these changes are almost always worth doing and talking about. Back to the article. Assess the trade-off that you're making between quality and pace and make sure it's appropriate for your context. Banger after banger, damn. There's always a trade-off between implementation speed and how confident you are about correctness. So you should ask yourself, how okay is it to ship bugs in my current context? If the answer to this doesn't affect the way you work, you're being overly inflexible. What a banger. God, coming out stronger than even me on it. What a way to say unit tests are useless if they're useless to you. Whew. So yeah, obviously I agree. I think that the way you write software that failures would kill people should be very different from the way you write software where failures mean they don't get a fancy emoji when they hit a button quite as fast as they would otherwise. It's important to recognize the difference in these types of things, where certain services should never fail, ever, and if they do, people die. And then there's other services, like especially in the startup world, where as unintuitive as it may seem, failures might actually be somewhat good. An interesting thing we learned when we were running Ping is that if we had 2 customers, one had no issues, they signed up and everything went well, and then one customer had some issue, big, small, whatever, and they report it to us. If we fix that issue for them fast enough and we get them involved in the conversation so they feel listened to, understood, and cared for, the customer that had the bug will be more loyal than the one who didn't. So if we had built everything in a way where it's harder to write bugs, we might have had less happy customers. Not even accounting for the fact that if we slowed things down enough to never ship bugs, we would never have shipped a lot of the features that our users wanted. And if they did still run into bugs, it would have taken us even more time to fix them. So ignoring all of that, having bugs was still better in our context and scenario. If we were making medical software, that would not be the case. We're making a silly app for streamers to collaborate. Very different use case, very different results, very, very different context. And you should adjust the way you work based on that context. Couldn't agree more. At my first job, I was working on greenfield projects around data processing, which had good systems in place for retroactively reprocessing data. The impact of shipping a bug was very minor. The proper response to that environment is to rely on the guardrails a bit, move faster because you can. You don't need 100% test coverage or an extensive QA process, which will slow down the pace of dev. At my second company, I was working on a product used by tens of millions of people, which involved high-value financial data and personally identifiable information. Even a small bug would entail a postmortem. I shipped features at a snail's pace, but I also think I may have shipped 0 bugs that year. Usually, you're not at the second company. I've seen a lot of devs err on the side of that sort of programming, though. I couldn't agree more. Even when I was at Twitch, I found a lot of teams trying to meet like Amazon's reliability standard. It's fucking Twitch. I loved working at Twitch. It was a great company building awesome things, and I'm streaming live on Twitch right now. By the way, every Wednesday, live on Twitch, if you want to see how I record these videos and hang out and chat with my homies here. Twitch is a great place to work. Twitch is a really cool product. Twitch does not need to have 6 nines of reliability. And if that results in us shipping worse features slower, it's a mistake. And the fact that we had such insane code coverage rules was just obnoxious. It actually resulted in us not shipping things well pretty regularly. A story I tell a lot because it haunts me is that we had, I think there was 80 or 90% code coverage as a rule. I had a feature that we rewrote to be about 1/10 as much code. So we had the old version, which was, let's make up numbers, let's say 100,000 lines of code. And we had the smaller version, which was 10,000 lines of code. Both are probably 10x smaller, doesn't matter. The 100,000 line of code version had code coverage a bit over 80%. The 10,000 line of code small version had code coverage at 100%. Both were in the project because it was feature flagged, so you'd get one or the other. We had moved 100% of users over to the new one. The new one was faster, it had new features, users liked it more, we were ready to go. Okay. So it's time to deprecate the old one, to delete that 100,000 line of code mess. I never could delete it because deleting it put us just below the code coverage threshold. Even though the feature I replaced it with had better code coverage, it didn't matter because the pure number of lines of code that were tested being removed was enough to just barely drop us under the threshold. And I would not be surprised if that giant pile of unused code still existed in the Twitch code base, simply because deleting it hurt a metric that didn't matter for a product where people can play games and talk to each other. That is, every layer of that is stupid. Every single one. And even if I loved working at Twitch, that's just proof of how dumb this is. The only code coverage number that's acceptable is 100%, and even that is dumb too. I digress. Anyways, as they were saying, usually you're not at the second company. I've seen a lot of devs err on the side of that sort of programming though. In situations where bugs aren't mission critical, which is 99% of web apps, totally agree, you're going to get further with shipping fast and fixing bugs fast than you would taking the time to make sure you're shipping pristine features on your first try. Totally agree. And I also agree that good tests should not think about code coverage percentages. But if you're going to enforce one, the only percentage of code coverage that makes any sense at all is 100. Still doesn't make much sense, but at least it makes some. A less than 100% number, nonsense, useless, throw it away. Next point. Spending time sharpening the axe is almost always worth it. Primogen's going to love that one. You're going to be renaming things. You're going to be typing type definitions, finding references, etc. a lot. And you should be fast at this. You should know all of the major shortcuts in your editor. You should be a confident and fast typist. You should know your OS well. You should be proficient in the shell. You should know how to use the browser dev tools efficiently and effectively. I can already tell people are going to be in the comments like, you can't just spend all day tweaking your NeoVim config. I mean, if you become a YouTuber that talks about NeoVim, you can, but I digress. Sometimes you need to chop the tree too. I don't think I've ever seen someone actually overdo this, though. One of the biggest green flags I've seen in new engineers is a level of care in choosing and becoming proficient with their tools. You know what? Fine. My issue is never that somebody's really excited about NeoVim. It's when they shame others for being less excited. If you want to go all in on NeoVim and really care about the tooling experience that you have, A+. If you're going to make fun of me for saying VS Code is good enough, get off my team. That's my line. Also, on that note, before I forget, I went through this phase, so I can talk all the shit I want. I still spent a whole summer at Amazon configuring my i3, Tmux, NeoVim, everything, because I wanted to be a real legit hacker so I could feel less like an imposter. And learning those skills helped me a ton. I got way better at ins and outs of navigating complex developer environments. That all said, once I got a MacBook, I kind of just drifted towards full screen VS Code. And I've been happy with it since. But like, I had to do my time in the trenches of a crazy complex developer experience setup that I owned all of and was really confident in before I could make that shift with similar confidence, where I just live in Command Tab and tilde. And as you guys can see, I have very little stuff open because I don't need to have a whole lot of stuff open. Next point. If you can't easily explain why something is difficult, then it's incidental complexity, which is probably worth addressing. I love that. I love this point. If you can't say why it's complex, you should fix it. Like, this is hard is not a good answer. This is hard because A, B, and C, where those things are simple, that's a good answer. My favorite manager in my career had a habit of pressing me when I would claim something was difficult to implement. Often, his response was something along the lines of, isn't this just a matter of sending up X when we Y? Or isn't this just like Z that we did a couple months ago? Very high-level objections is what I'm trying to say. Not on the level of the actual functions and classes that we were dealing with, which is what I was trying to explain. I think conventional wisdom is that it's just annoying when managers simplify things like this. I know I've pissed off a lot of people doing that, but a shockingly high percentage of the time, I'd realize when he was pressing me that most of the complexity I was explaining was incidental complexity, and that I could actually address that first, thus making the problem as trivial as he was making it sound. This sort of thing tends to make future changes easier as well. I'll drop the hot take of this is why I like React and a lot of the new React stuff, is once you stop thinking about those details and you plan the system and make decisions around the design, I actually find it to be much easier to both build and reason about. And then long-term, most importantly, it makes it easier to maintain. These are all good things. Try to solve bugs one layer deeper. Ooh, and React's already coming up. Oh boy. Imagine you have a React component in a dashboard that deals with a user object retrieved from state of the currently logged in user. You see a bug report in Sentry. Sentry plug, channel sponsor, they're not sponsoring this. Great product for debugging stuff though. You see a bug in Sentry where a user was null during render. You could add a quick if no user returned null, or you could investigate a bit more and find that your logout function makes two distinct state updates. The first is setting the user to null, and then the second is redirecting the user to the home page. You swap the two, and now no component will ever have this bug again because the user object is never null when you're within the dashboard. Keep doing the first sort of bug fix and you end up with a mess. Keep doing the second type of bug fix and you'll have a clean system and a deep understanding of the invariance. Makes perfect sense. It's so tempting to just if no user return null. I will say, as a huge React query fan, I've been guilty of this where I solve those error cases where they're coming up with errors. But since, especially with like the new model, I find myself just defining within the call the right thing. The update to set things to null should also send you to the right place. I absolutely agree you should aim for the second type of fix. Don't underestimate the value of digging into history to investigate some bugs. Again, reading pull requests, all that stuff, really, really good strategies. I've always been pretty good at debugging weird issues with the usual toolkit of print line and the debugger, so I never really looked at Git much to figure out the history of a bug. But for some bugs, it's crucial. I recently had an issue with my server where it was leaking memory seemingly constantly, and then getting out of memory killed and restarted. I couldn't figure out the cause of this for the life of me. Every likely culprit was ruled out, and I couldn't reproduce it locally. It felt like throwing darts blindfolded. I've certainly had bugs that felt like that, and it is miserable. I looked at the commit history and found that it started happening after I added support for Play Store payments. Never a place I would have looked in a million years. It's just a couple of HTTP requests. Turns out it was getting stuck in an infinite loop of fetching access tokens, and after the first one expired. Maybe every request only added a kilobyte or so to the memory, but when they're retrying every 10 milliseconds or so on multiple threads, that starts to add up quick. And usually this is the sort of thing that would have resulted in a Stack Overflow, but I was using async recursion in Rust, which doesn't Stack Overflow. Rust, a great programming language. This never would have occurred to me, but when I'm forced to look into a specific bit of code that I know must have caused it, suddenly the theory pops up. I'm not sure what the rule is here for when to do this and when not to. It's intuition-based, in a different sort of, to a bug report that triggers this sort of investigation. You'll develop the intuition over time, but it's enough to know that sometimes it's invaluable if you're stuck. Along similar lines, try out Git bisect if the problem is amenable to it, meaning a Git history of small commits, a quick automated way to test for the issue, and you have one commit you know is bad and one that's good. I'm going to go a slightly weird angle with this for my own advice. Make it deploy, then make it useful. I'd find that a lot of devs early on, especially myself, would spend so much time trying to make the code work locally on their machine that by the time they had it working, it was already complex enough that deploying it was non-viable. With modern tools that make CI and CD easy, like Vercel, Netlify, any of these other options, you can just link your project to a GitHub repo, and now it will auto-deploy, auto-build, and auto-publish any changes you make when you push up the commits, which makes it significantly easier in a situation like this where you're trying to figure out which commit broke. You're trying to figure out why deploys aren't working or why out of memory is happening. If you have the ability to auto deploy every version, you can go look at an old version and see whether or not it was working as expected. These types of things become exponentially easier, and the amount of time you'll spend dealing with these things is exponentially lower. One more similar thing, learn Git really early. I know this one's gotten me into trouble, but the confidence you get from realizing making changes isn't scary is huge. When I started school, it was very clear to me that my peers were scared when I would use their machines and delete code, because to them, code deleted was code gone forever. But if you learn the basics of Git, you don't worry anywhere near as much. Yeah, this is a great reference. I helped a dev a while back who was trying to deploy their giant remix project onto Vercel. I was the one screen sharing. You could even tell from the terminal there, that's obviously me. That's my color coding. That's my tmux everything. That was my machine, because I was so annoyed that the particular dev that was having the problem was insisting that Vercel was the issue, even though they had never once got it to deploy. So my response was, what the fuck? Can we get this remix? Can we get a remix project to deploy, and then we can debug the difference between the two? Because you should have made this deploy as soon as you made it. And I was able to get it working in like 10 minutes once I jumped in, even with like Lee, Rob, and crew hopping in too. It was a fun, chaotic experience that absolutely could have been settled if the dev had deployed before they built. So as unintuitive as it might sound to put deploy first before you make something useful, trust me, it makes life better. And that's why in all of my tutorials, I deploy really, really early, and then we do the rest after. Back to the article. This is a great article, by the way. Shout out M. Buffett. We'll give you a big shout out near the end. I'm sure I'll put their Twitter in the description too. Give them a follow. It's really easy to write terrible code, but it's also really easy to write code that follows absolutely every best practice, which has been unit integration, fuzz, and mutation tested for good measure. Your startup will just run out of money before you finish. Don't forget those Airbnb ESLint rules that Airbnb doesn't even use. So a lot of programming is figuring out the balance. Absolutely agree. I'm going to drop the hot take of simple almost always scales. One more of mine. Aim for simple. It scales well. I'll even put surprisingly well. I find people will look at a simple thing and say, oh, what happens when that's at enterprise scale? Well, if the architecture is simple enough, then the way it scales up as it gets more difficult is way less bad than something that starts difficult and has more complexity as you go. And it's a balance. It's absolutely a balance. But if you aim for simple, the likelihood that things scale well is actually higher, not lower. And people love to pretend otherwise, and they're wrong. If you err on the side of writing code quickly, you'll occasionally get bitten by a bad bit of tech debt. You'll learn stuff like, I should add great testing for data processing because it often is impossible to correct later. Or, I should really think through table design because changing things without downtime can be extremely hard. If you err on the side of writing perfect code, you don't get any feedback. Sorry, Rust devs. Things just universally take a long time. You don't know where you're spending your time on things that really deserve it and matter, or if you're just wasting that time. Feedback mechanisms are essential for learning, and you're not getting that. I absolutely agree. I was just filming a video earlier about Ladybird, which is a new browser that's entirely unusable because its goal is implementing web standards, not being a good usable browser. As a result, the likelihood that they get actual feedback about what is and isn't working is way lower. Versus the browser I'm using, Arc, which I've used for a while now, still has a fun bug where when I click the collections tab, because I download a lot of things, it lags. My browser is chugging now because I have some 1,000 files in that folder, which means I can give them that feedback and they're rethinking decisions around their entire Swift architecture because Swift is so bad at long lists. But they're able to learn these things and make these changes because they have actual users because they ship something sooner. Versus Ladybird, which isn't going to use any existing solutions. They're building everything themselves. And as a result, the amount of time it takes for them to get any feedback at all is massive. To be clear, I don't mean bad as in I couldn't remember the syntax for creating a hash map, so I did 2 inner loops instead. I mean bad like the following. Instead of a rewrite of our data ingestion to make the specific state unrepresentable, I added a couple asserts over our invariants at a couple key checkpoints. Yeah. Our server models are exactly the same as the DTOs we would write, so I just serialized those instead of writing all the boilerplate so we can write the DTOs later as needed. I skipped writing tests for these components because they're trivial and a bug in one of them is no big deal. I mean, that's all components ideally, but yeah, good examples. Make debugging easier. I like that one a lot. Let's see what he has to say here. There's so many little tricks I've acquired over the years on making software easier to debug. If you don't make any effort to make debugging easy, you're going to spend unacceptable amounts of time debugging each issue as your software gets more and more complex. Hey, Next.js, make things easier to debug, please, thanks. I know you're working on it. I know Versal's working on it. I just had to point that out because if you don't have browser tools, things are a lot harder. It's a great point too. You'll be terrified to make changes because even a couple new bugs might take you a week to figure out. Yep, there's plenty of code bases I'm scared to touch because I'm more likely to add a bug than fix the thing I'm trying to fix in the first place. Here's some examples of what I mean. By the way, this person's a huge chess bro and has a couple cool chess services they've built. For the backend of Chessbook, they have a command to copy all of a user's data down to local so they can reproduce issues easily with only a username. Based. They trace every local request with OpenTelemetry, making it very easy to see how a request spends its time. Also based, even though OpenTelemetry is a shit standard. I have a Scratch file that acts as a pseudo REPL, which re-executes on every change. Ooh, I love this. I'm a big fan of having a sandbox file in your project so that you can just try things there and not have to spin a bunch of stuff up to do it. This makes it easy to pull out bits of code and play around with it to get a better idea of what's going on. Love it. Totally agree. Ooh, here's a fun one. In staging, they limit parallelism to 1 so that it's easier to visually parse logs. Ooh, spicy. I like it. For the front end, I have a debug requests setting, which prevents optimistic loading of data to make it easier to debug requests. Interesting. I think I dig that. I also have a debug state setting that will print out the entire state of the program after each update, along with a pretty diff of what happened. They also have a file full of little functions that get the UI into specific states, so that as they're trying to fix bugs, they don't have to keep clicking in the UI to get to that state. I should have more of that. It's a weird example, but I have this project, Doge T3GG, so I actually put this little query param on the page where dev mode is true. Now we get this thing on the page where I can really quickly add a bunch of values, add money, and then get this into the state I'm trying to debug at any given time. This was essential to getting this working. I can't imagine how I would have built this project without it. There's definitely not a really popular project in the front-end world that is significantly more annoying than it ever should be, that people use because getting their components into the right state is really hard. That's definitely not a thing. It's not like people would use this component library tool to debug UI because they don't have a way to get the UI into the state that they're actually testing. That would be absurd. There's definitely not a whole industry of people making really annoying tools that keep getting misused because UI devs kind of suck. That's definitely not a thing. Unrelated website, by the way. Ignore whatever I was just scrolling. Totally don't know how I ended up there. Yeah, having ways to get your components into the state that they should be, yeah, you should. And every dev should normalize that. The idea of making it easy to see, play with, debug, etc., it helps with places you wouldn't even expect. Like having these tools makes QA easier too. It's good. It's really good practice to find simple ways to get your application into the states that you're actually working on. It also will encourage you, by the way, to make things simpler. Because if it's too hard to get things in the right state, you'll start to realize ways to simplify that state management. And those are almost always worthwhile. Stay vigilant about how much of your debugging time is spent on setup, reproduction, and cleanup afterwards. If it's over 50%, you should figure out how to make it easier, even if that will take slightly longer this time. Bugs should get easier to fix over time, all else being equal. I hate that's a spicy take because it's entirely correct. As a code base gets more complex, you should be counteracting that by making reproduction even easier to deal with. When working on a team, you should usually ask the question. I'm putting that in mind too. Dumb questions rule. I've talked about this a bunch. I can't even remember which videos I have because it's been so many. The dumb questions rule is a thing I apply to new engineers when they join my team. I mandate a minimum number of dumb questions that they have to ask every day. If they haven't asked me at least one dumb question every day for their first week or two, the day's not over until they ask the question. The reason I push this is because devs, and honestly everyone, is really insecure about feeling dumb and saying dumb things. So I force them to get over that by making them do it. Ask the dumb question. And it kind of goes back to this point earlier of taking feedback from unfamiliar devs more seriously. Because the dumb question is a thing others probably thought when they were trying the project for the first time, but they were too scared to say. And if you don't get that feedback, you'll never know. And this goes both ways. If you're the dev that always asks the question, you're more likely to be working in code bases that solve these problems. Because if everyone on the team isn't willing to say it, and you're also not willing to say it, it won't get fixed. But even if everyone else isn't willing, but you are, all of a sudden these things start to get fixed. So it's really important to ask the questions, even if no one else on your team is. In the worst cases, You get fired for it, and you can find a team that's better aligned with you. There's a spectrum of trying to figure out everything for yourself versus bugging your coworkers with every little question. And I think most people start their careers way too far on the former side. Absolutely agree. It has been hard for me to find people who ask too many questions when they're working with me. There are absolutely people who are not working for me that are just random people in my DMs asking me all sorts of stupid shit. Totally see that that is a problem. But for the vast majority of people, especially once they're employed, they're almost scared to ask the question. And you got to push them to. Or if you're that person, you just got to do it. Don't be scared to ask the question, almost ever. There's always someone around that has been in the code base for longer or knows technology X way better than you, or knows the product better, or is just a more experienced engineer in general. There's so many times in that first 6 months of working somewhere where you could spend over an hour figuring something out, or you could get the answer in a few minutes. Again, really important point. I can't tell you how many times the dumb question ended up being, well, I've been stuck on this for 4 hours. Do you have any tips on how to get this particular tool working? And my response was, oh, yeah, you should run these 2 commands instead. I should update the docs for that. My bad. I'm going to go fix that. And now this thing that they had spent hours on gets solved in like 30 seconds and our docs improve. Huge. Massive. This is a great thing. Thank you, Schaller, for sharing this. Junior dev here. I've been praised as the best on my team at asking questions. Ask the question. You don't have to be an experienced engineer to ask good questions. In fact, the inexperienced engineers, they have a massive advantage because they have better questions because they're not going to default to existing knowledge that might be incorrect. They're going to challenge the thing and they're going to ask great questions as a result. Lean into that as a junior dev and as an experienced one. Get those questions, get that feedback. It's all so helpful. This happens all the time. I would love if you have this to link it because this happens 5 times a day. There is no world in which I remember your specific question. Like we all have these moments that haunt. You know what? One more piece of advice. That one dumb thing that haunts you, nobody remembers it. I have plenty of those. I have so many of these moments where like, wow, I can't believe I thought that or did that. Like here's a fun one that actually got brought up because others remembered it for me. So bad example, but I love it. I didn't know React Query could be used for things that weren't GraphQL until Tanner Lindsley was on Jason Langsdorff's stream. There's actually in the VOD, I bet I could find it. Yeah, cool. Almost certainly going to be at this timestamp. Yes. Look at me in chat there. Look at that. I am so stupid and somehow just realized React Query isn't just a GraphQL client. I need to go do a very deep dive. And this was October 21st, 2020. We've all had these issues. We've all had that moment where we feel dumb and nobody remembers. The only reason that one got noticed is somebody else was watching the video and said, yo, Theo, I saw you pop up in stream here. Look at your comments. I was like, wow, holy fuck, I'm dumb. But no one else remembered. No one remembers those moments. Don't worry about it. And again, the only time that this would ever annoy people if you're asking too many questions is if it's clear you could have found the answer yourself in a few minutes. And even then, it can be useful because you might not have known the strategy to find the answer. And if I then show you that, awesome, you'll ask less questions. I've had once or twice in my career where somebody would ask questions over and over, and I'm like, okay, how did you try to figure this out? And then realize they didn't know about one of the docs resources or one of the things to search or sort for. And when I showed them that, they would stop. Like almost every time, if you're asking too many questions, it's because you haven't been shown the way to find the answers. And if you ask too many questions, awesome. Now we can realize that deficiency exists and we can plug it. After you responded to me, I sat down and got really into understanding how these things actually work. So it helped you a ton. That's awesome. I'm sorry if I was harsh in the reply there, but it sounds like you used that opportunity to level up and be better. Like even if I didn't handle your question well, it seems like you handled it awesome. And I really hope that you're not scared of asking questions in the future because that's dope. To have you here, have you sharing this experience and have you productive enough to deeply understand Next now, you massively leveled up as a result of that. So I love that. Shipping cadence matters a lot. Think hard about what will get you shipping quickly and often. Whew, love this. Startups have limited runway. Projects have deadlines. When you quit your job to strike out on your own, your savings will only last you so many months. This hits too deep. This hurts me in my soul. Fuck. Whew. Ideally, your speed on a project only compounds over time. I have another Theo point, and it's not even that related to this, but it's inspiring me. You don't know what level you're at until you get an offer at that level somewhere else. Companies love to make you think you're not a certain level because they don't want to pay you for that promotion. So they always make the promotion process hell. There was a window where I didn't think I was a senior dev because I was having problems getting my senior doc to get started. I was just getting my managers to do it was annoying. Turns out those managers sucked. And when I started applying to other companies, not only was I massively exceeding their bar for senior, I was approaching the staff level bar. And I didn't realize that because I didn't realize I should be talking to other companies and not basing my ability on what this one particular person thinks they should or shouldn't sign off on. Because the reality was, if that manager promoted me, they'd have one less headcount for a senior dev. But if they didn't promote me, they could hire another senior dev and have me underpaid, outworking that senior dev. It was an obvious win for my team, so I never understood what my actual level was because my company had a competitive advantage of not telling me. And then when I figured it out, gave them the finger and quit, they were worse off as a result. Regardless, this happens all the time, and you as an individual developer should know how much you're actually worth, what your skills actually look like measured up against other actual companies. So do interviews a ton. I'll even put that as a point. Interview a lot. At least once every 6 months. One more on this topic, give interviews. If you're qualified for the role, you're qualified to interview for the role. Yeah, I find so many devs take way too long to get into the interview process on both sides. They take too long to start getting interviews to work at a company, and once they're at the company, they're hesitant to start giving interviews. Interviews are essential to our success and growth and opportunities as devs. You got to push through it. It sucks, but you have to. Give interviews, do interviews, deeply understand interviews. If you can't do those well, you're massively bottlenecking yourself and your capabilities, certainly bottlenecking your success. Yeah, this hit deep. The reason I thought of all of that is I just started thinking too much about quitting and going off on my own and realizing at that moment, oh shit, I should have quit a while earlier. I am very down if you're down to share, but no pressure at all, Huji. I still want to understand why the session never gets past the client. This is strange as fuck to me. The data is there, but it simply never receives the prop. I'm looking all over for the solution. This one was not actually particularly obvious. Yeah, I'm going to drop an even hotter take for you, Huji. This wasn't a problem with your understanding so much as Next being shitty. Get server-side props being a function, both for redirecting and for passing props, is bad. This code shows just how bad the conflation of concerns that existed in old Pages router was. The fact that you could do this, that you could return a redirect and props, is a fundamental design failure in Next. So I do not blame you at all for this. This is why old Next.js sucked. And this is also why I think new Next.js is so good. It does a great job at solving these problems by not having these magic functions that have all of these different roles. You just component style call what you're doing when you do it. So I actually am pumped that you found this example because it's subtle, but it actually perfectly showcases the types of design failures that the old Next model by design encouraged a lot of. So phenomenal. Oh, I missed your follow-up question too. My bad on that. You pass session as props. It does not show in the props. Initial problem. I think I understand now. So whenever you send the data, grabs app, grabbing session provider. So whenever you send the data of the session as props, self is grabbing it, passing it. Yep. To be clear, these things were way more complex than they should have been. And none of this is your fault. Like, I really want to emphasize that point. This design sucked because of Next. And I actually love that you brought this up as an example because, yeah, this was your huge learning is you had only worked in single page apps and this abstraction for them wasn't great. Like, that was a good question because it was like, you didn't pretend you understood more than you did. You said that it doesn't make sense. It's small. I'm going to give you a massive compliment here. There's a lot of subtle things in this question that I think you did really well. I want to understand. You didn't say this is wrong or dumb. You didn't say this problem sucks or that this tool sucks. You said that you want to understand why this strange thing is happening. And you even said it's strange to you. The qualifiers here are actually incredible. This is like almost like an artistic example of like a really, really good question when you feel lost and clueless. You owned that it was your desire to understand. This was the fact that you said the word understand before describing the problem, that you want to understand. Huge green flag. You're not just trying to fix the problem and move on. You want to understand it. And it's strange to you. You know it might not be strange to others. You know that there might be something better that's just not clicking for you. This is a great, great question. So yeah, I wouldn't even qualify this as a dumb question, honestly. If you had presented this to me as an employee of mine as your dumb question, I would have said, no, that's a good question. Come back with a dumber one later. This is great. A+. Fantastic representation. And like, to anyone looking for examples of how to ask a question about something you don't understand, here you go. Just say it. Say that you want to understand and you don't, and say what is confusing to you. Fantastic. A++. Thank you for sharing that, Hujiro, by the way. Like, that's really good gold example of asking a question when you're clueless, which people are really scared to do. If you just don't understand at all, it's scary to ask the question, but you did it. You learned a bunch, and now I get to highlight you in a video as an example of these types of things. A+s all around. I love this shit. Thank you for sharing. Don't worry about having to participate in the time and all that, but if you're down and you're here, clearly you bring a lot of value, so pumped to have you here, man. Anyways, let's see what this author has to say. Ideally, your speed on a project only compounds over time until you're shipping features faster than you could have ever imagined. To ship fast, you need to do a lot of things. Oh, I'm so pumped that you're the best person to teach. Like, knowing that you ask questions that well means you're going to set a really good example for the students. The fact that there's people that are learning from you makes me very, very excited. Back to these examples of things that you should do if you want to ship fast. You need a system that isn't prone to bugs. You need a quick turnaround time between teams. You need a willingness to cut out the 10% of a new feature that's going to take half the time. Yep, this sounds a lot. The number of times I see a product, a feature, a tech plan, a spec that would be way, way simpler if we trim one or two things. Half my videos where I'm ranting about old jobs are just me complaining about this specifically. So couldn't agree more. Consistent reusable patterns that you can compose together for new screens, features, and endpoints. Yep. This is a huge part of why React won, by the way. The fact that the patterns and the components can all be reused, composed, stacked, and done all of these crazy ways. That's why React really took off early, because it scaled well to small projects and big projects, and it lets you move really fast. Quick and easy deploys. Wow, I must have pre-read when I said make it deploy, then make it useful. Crazy. Process that doesn't slow you down, like flaky tests, slow CI, fuzzy linters, slow PR reviews, Jira as a religion, etc. Yep. And about a million other things. Of course. Shipping slowly should merit a post-mortem as much as breaking production does. Holy spicy take that I love. Our industry doesn't run like that, but that doesn't mean you can't personally follow the North Star of shipping fast. Couldn't agree more at every scale. I just dropped the link in the reply to this tweet because that was such a great article. I know I say that a lot, but holy shit. I'm very thankful for this author. When I found this article initially, I quickly checked their Twitter. They were following me. I was like, oh my God, awesome. I reached out. They were really hyped. And God, I'm excited for them to see this video because that was great. I say this a lot, but that article was great. I haven't agreed that hard on something I've read on stream for a while. Let me know what you think in the comments, though, and what you learned that might benefit you as an experienced dev or as a new one. Until next time, peace, nerds.